Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting this evening. And I'd like to recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage, past, present and future. And I extend our deep respect to all First Nations people in attendance here this evening. Well, welcome to tonight's Provocations Public Lecture, co-hosted by the Royal Society of New South Wales and Charles Sturt University, here in the wonderful surroundings of the chapel at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. My name's Mark Evans and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research here at Charles Sturt University and your Master of Ceremonies for this evening's event. Provocations is a series of public lectures, panel discussions and blogs written by prominent thinkers that seek to address some of the grand intellectual and social challenges confronting Australia and the world. Our inaugural Provocations Public Lecture was delivered by Professor Sharon McLeod on the theme, Children Should Be Seen and Heard, the importance of communication so children can thrive. And in this lecture this evening, A New History of Political Thought, Professor Wayne Hudson will discuss why there is no general history of Australian political thought and the research strategies that might enable such a history to be written. He contends that Australians have underestimated the range of political ideas that came to Australia, that they've often misunderstood how these ideas were interpreted here and have been slow to grasp the originality of Australian political thought. And Wayne is currently writing a book to remedy this. It's at a very advanced stage. A few words by way of introducing Wayne, and I'm not going to go through Wayne's biography because there wouldn't be any time for a lecture if I was to do that. Wayne Hudson studied history and law at the University of Sydney and German philosophy at Oxford University, where he worked with the renowned Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski. I always pronounce that badly. He works across the fields of philosophy, history, politics and religion, and his intellectual journey has taken him to Oxford, Utrecht, the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, McGill University in Canada, Beijing Foreign Studies University, the Institute of Law of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the Centre for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Griffith University. And he's now, we're delighted to actually say that he's a research professor here at Charles Sturt University. Wayne's research addresses connections between utopianism, heterodoxy, and social reform. He's published 24 books and counting, and 84 refereed articles, and he's recently been elected to the Australian Academy of the Humanities for his incredible contribution to the history of political thought in particular here in Australia. Wayne's now completing 3 further monographs on contemporary Enlightenment, and these works draw on his reinterpretation of Schelling's Berlin Lectures and on his work on Friedrich Hegel and Fred Bloch. Now, Wayne and I are office buddies, and when I first came to work at Charles Sturt last year, I would hear him through the walls. Our walls are very thin. Talking in the corridor outside my office, often with anybody, to be honest, and largely about the history of ideas. So we've now got very well-educated cleaning staff at the centre. But I'm the the child of two professors of political theory, I should say that, at Manchester University. So I've been brought up, right, discussing these issues around the dinner table. But even for me, I would stop what I was doing and just listen to his stream of thought. And given my background in political science, I'm not joking, I've been stunned by not just his conceptual rigor, but actually the practical application of that thinking to real-world problems. And I've been so lucky to engage with Wayne on a whole range of topics. And the great thing I can say about Wayne is I always come away from those conversations feeling inspired and having learned something new. Right? And I couldn't give anybody a greater tribute than that. And he's just, he's, in my view, one of the last great polymaths, and there's not many polymaths left. And he's a wonder to be around. I'm not joking, such a kind and generous colleague we couldn't wish for. Ladies and gentlemen, Wayne Hudson.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's very hard to speak after that. I don't know what I could say to confirm it, and I think anything I might say might disconfirm it. I also don't know how to fulfill my brief, because my brief is to be provocative, controversial and exciting, and professorial and scholarly and dull. I've had two goes at this before, one at the ANU and one more proximate to this. The first one succeeded, but the main Australian intellectuals didn't come. The second one failed appallingly, and so I sat down this afternoon and prepared you a typed text. I rarely read a typed text. I always bring one, but I normally at the last minute have heavenly revelations and say something else. Well, tonight I'm going to break all the rules and read a typed text. And I can now, thank you to the staff, read it. I couldn't read it a quarter of an hour ago, but we can now read it. And I want to say, because it's very important, I know nothing about Australia and nothing about Australian political thought. Now that is a bit funny, I agree, but it implies, and it's true, that I do know something about something else. So what I'm able to do in the area of Australian history is not tell you about anything, but relate it to things you probably don't know. So I know more about China than Australia, more about Germany than Australia, more about Russia than Australia, certainly a lot more about Western Europe than Australia. So I'm bringing the outsider's view. I'm an interloper. I'm, to some extent, a fraud. Now, of course, I do write about Australia. It would be wrong to say I don't. I've done a book on Australian citizenship, which had some influence. I've recently done a book on Australian jurists and Christianity. I once did 3 books on Australian republicanism, so if you're interested in that, I know something about that. I did a book on creating the Australian nation, and I did a book, and this is the best of the Australian books, Australian religious thought. And in that book I created a lot of controversy by saying that this was a highly religious country, that the religious people here aren't churchy, they're disbelievers, and that this religious thought was of international importance. Well, historians didn't think any of that was true. Stuart McIntyre, the senior historian, launched the book in Melbourne and said, unfortunately, the theses are totally wrong. I can say, and I'm very proud to say this, that in the last thing Stuart wrote before he died, which is in this book, he recants. And he says, I don't like anything Wayne says. But he's right. Well, tonight I'm going to have a go at the same argument exactly for Australian political thought. And as in the religious thought book, I'm not coming as someone who knows. I'm coming as someone who doesn't know, but for that very reason can shake the tree. And so I'm shaking the tree. And I'm saying something negative about Australia, which may offend everyone here, and something very positive. But what I want you to do is see how they connect. Not just that there's a negative bit, but that it's what's behind the positive. And the two are connected in a new way. Now, I am going to read as far as I can. If I run out of time, they'll let me know, and I'll go back to taking jokes. In this lecture, I apply a philosophically informed global intellectual history methodology to Australian political thought, in contrast to the national intellectual history approach dominating the historiography. This approach combines macro and micro history. It looks wide to find the relevant data, and it looks small to notice international influences, material in other languages than English, geography, context, changes in the meaning of words. To do so, I contest the conceptuality which currently governs the field. So that's what I'm doing. I'm shaking the conceptuality that governs the field. And I also introduce substantive new evidence. So 2 tricks. First trick, shake the conceptuality. Second trick, new evidence. Little bit of new evidence? No. Several libraries full of new evidence. That's the point. In this lecture, I take political thought to be about the delineation and thematization of political concepts, and not the ideas of politicians, although the two may sometimes overlap. I also take, and this is crucial, originality to mean socio-historical originality and not romantic originality. So I'm not saying the original thinkers in Australia have no precedent anywhere on the earth. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they are putting forward ideas that add to the sum of human cultural wealth in important and original way. So not romantic originality. And also I don't assume that originality is a good thing. So some of my argument is that they're original in a bad way. I won't go into that too much, but you see the point. I don't want originality to be a cheer word. It has to have a scientific test that is tougher. I should also emphasise that I'm only at the beginning of the research. I haven't read all the master's and PhD theses, and what I say tonight may need qualification over time. I expect that it will. So I've divided the lecture into parts to make it a bit easier. And I'm going to suggest to you there was more Australian political thought than historians have imagined. Not just slightly more, 100 times more. That much of it was original, and that understanding this originality can help us to do 2 extremely important things. The first one is to reform the national imaginary. Now, when I say that, some people get very upset because they've forgotten the sociology of nationalism. The sociology of nationalism is that all nation-states have delusional imaginaries. So when I say the Australian national imaginary is delusional, it's only because that's true of every nation-state there's ever been. Think of Russia at the moment. And the second point is that understanding our political thought can help us play a better part in the new Asia and help our relationship with China. The last thing we need to do with China is claim to be the most stupid people in the world. Now, I begin by offering a series of refinements, and some of them are a bit worrying, but some of them aren't. In this literature, you have to be very careful of the word Australian, because it's often understood in an atavistic way, as if people who get off the boat are Australian, wherever they come from, and they're not Australian if they get on a boat. Now, that has catastrophic consequences. Imagine writing about Irish literature and not allowing Joyce to be mentioned or Beckett to be mentioned because they went away from Ireland. Ridiculous. But we do that in Australian thought. We don't include people who leave. And once you get here, even if you're Korea or you're from Zimbabwe, you become an Australian. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? And so it means that vast numbers of Australian intellectuals who are highly original have been left out of the story. If you leave, you're not in the story. The literature also fails to account of the geography of the country. Now, this, again, is extremely worrying. So it's basically about Melbourne and Sydney, not much about South Australia, Western Australia, almost nothing about Tasmania or the Northern Territory, and until recently, nothing about Queensland. Well, put all that, and let alone, but what about if the Australians aren't even on the land? What about if they're in New Guinea or Chile or Southeast Asia or in the Pacific? Well, they won't go in, will they? And so you put all that together, you begin to see there's a huge problem, because you don't have the evidence analysed. You don't have the evidence recorded. You don't have the evidence connected. And when you suggest there's no original thought here, well, how do you know? Now, a little bit more. Unfortunately, and everyone here knows this, but I have to say it, the literature in this field has not until recently included Indigenous thinkers, women, or thinkers whose first language was not English. Most of the books and articles are about white Anglo-Saxon men. Now, that's justifiable in some context, because after all, they were probably running the country. But as a general story, it becomes catastrophic. Now, I'm not saying that what's been written about Australian political thought, we have two of the finest scholars in the country here tonight, is not of enormous value. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that we have to rethink it and put a new set of concepts on it. A simple way of saying that you will understand is Australianism is essential, but it can't be one-sided. So if you want to talk about birds in Australia, you're going to say there are Australian birds. Great. But most of the birds in Canberra are not from Australia. And if you go to the local wetlands, you'll find them from every country in the world. And it's the same in the intellectual history of the country. Yes, there are important Australians, and some of them were Australianists, that's very fair. But an enormous number of people came here from other places, as you know, and we can't leave them out of the story. And we can't decide they're not genuine Australians because they can read books. Now, putting all that together, and one last point before I move on, a lot of the literature on Australian political thought has a gross secularist bias. There's a story in this country that we started out with convicts and that our people have been anti-religious from the beginning. This is all complete nonsense. This is a very religious country, and if you try to understand the political thought in Australia, it's over-determined by Anglican, Protestant and Catholic thought. And you've only got to read it to see that's true. But nobody notices what it means. Just take the Catholic case, for example. Well, every Catholic bishop was educated in Rome or Leuven. So they come back with tons of church Latin, very, very fluent Italian and a bit of French, and a lot of them have some German as well. Well, if you don't put that in the story, you get a very strange feeling about Australian country towns. Charters Towers, for example. Think about Charters Towers in Queensland. Australian historians behave as though no one ever went there. Now, I'm now going to say something a bit different. The literature on Australian political thought has a tendency to emphasise the cultural capital that came here from overseas. And that's right, and it is very, very important. But we shouldn't assume that Australian political thought is derivative because it's influenced by foreign sources. Enormous amount of cultural capital came to Australia, much more than historians have imagined. But it's essential to grasp that very much of it was not British or English or Irish or Scottish. Australian historians tend not to recognise that because the only language they can think in is English. And if you want to be really nasty, Australian English. They may speak other languages in the restaurant, but they don't read them in an intellectual sense. And this leads to a misunderstanding of even the English thought that came. And I won't go into that in detail, but I'll give you two examples. You'll see it immediately. All Australian political thought people know about Thomas Hobbes. Absolutely, we all read it at university. But Hobbes has 10 volumes in Latin, and no Australian historians ever read those. And then they talk about John Locke. Huge influence in Australia, John Locke. Well, in a way, yes, but in a way, no, because Locke, of course, was influenced by the Dutch collegians. And I don't think any Australian historian actually knows anything about the Dutch collegians or Dutch religious thought. I do. I lived there for 7 years, so I do know something about it. And then the argument continues. And obviously American political thought was important here too, we all know that. But what you may not know is that New South Wales may have supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. All right. Now, I'm going to leave all that out, except the next bit out, except to say to you that German and French and Italian and Russian political thought were all extremely important here. If you want, I can talk about each of them and what came here and what didn't and who they influenced. But just to give you one very simple example, there were several waves of wonderful Russian migration. Communist Party was set up when the Soviet Union sent someone to set it up. Of course it was. And in Russia, in Brisbane, which you all know is the Australian intellectual capital, there was a very vast Russian press. And it's now been examined, and it's full of amazing intellectual things. And in Brisbane, as you may also know, there's a paper called the Courier Mail, which is thought to be the worst paper in Australia. Well, if you read it in 1900, it reviews all the theological controversies of Europe. Brisbane, Courier Mail, 1900. So you're getting a bit of a picture that we've got the history of our country significantly wrong by underestimating our people, by underestimating who came, by underestimating what they thought when they came, and by getting the idea that they're following foreign trends. Thank you. Well, the next question I want to address is what kinds of political thought came to Australia. Thank you. Okay, what kinds of political thought came to Australia? In the literature, there's some discussion of 5 to 10 different strands. I've had a look. I haven't finished looking. I'm still working on it. I found 50. So if there are 50 strands of political thought here, 45 of which have been largely ignored, you get a sense of the problem I'm addressing. If we looked at them, we'd find an enormous amount. Well, I go through, in the larger version of the text, I go through all of them. Well, I won't do that now. I'll just mention Indigenous political thought in the work of Aileen Moreton Robinson. If you don't know that, you should buy it tomorrow. Outstanding work by an Aboriginal scholar. I'll say something about legalism in Australia, which of course was extremely important and has not been understood because people who try to study it now don't have classical Greek. But of course, everyone in the 19th century had classical Greek, and you couldn't go to Sydney University without Latin. And people who had classical Greek, of course, knew about India and learned Sanskrit. All the early histories of India in English are written by British lawyers. And then there's utilitarianism. There's a thesis in the literature. Bentham is the real source of Australian institutions. Bentham is the great influence here. Well, yes, it's important in South Australia. Yes, it's important in Tasmania. But the important influence isn't Bentham in Australia. It's Mill. And although Australians were influenced by utilitarianism, they never understood the meta-theoretical side. So if you talk about mathematical logic in utilitarianism, people doing Australian political thought go to sleep. Then there's republicanism. We all know that's very important here. Yes, but you probably don't know that at the time of federation, in the 18th century and in the 19th century, 90% of Australian Republicans were civic Republicans and followers of the main British thinker, Harrington. Harrington was the closest friend of Charles I, and an outstanding Republican theorist and a monarchist. Until Federation, most important Republicans in Australia were monarchists. And you might think, well, what about the Irish? What about people in the undergrounds of Sydney and Melbourne? Well, there were a few of them, yes, but they were mainly just off the boat. Whereas Wentworth, founding the Australian political thought tradition, is a passionate civic Republican. There is literature on this, but it tells you an enormous amount that it's written by a Canadian. Well, if we go a little bit further, we can go into the other trends. I won't go through all of them. I'll mention environmental theory, which is outstanding. This country leads the world in that area. I'll mention the important critical theory here. People know about Australian critical theory, but they may have forgotten that it came from Budapest when Lukács's best students came to Australia. And there's been a huge amount of written in Australia about French political thought by people whose French is better than mine. Well, all right, well, how many political thought people were there in Australia? I mean, have you got more than 9? Well, yes, I've got 200, and I won't go through them all, but you get the message immediately. I have a long list. And many people here will know all the people on the list, but it will never occur to you that they all wrote important political thought. And to make it worse, I'm looking very closely at 20 people. And these people, I'm saying, are original by world standards. They're not just original in the sense that they wrote a couple of letters to the Sydney Morning Herald or something. They're people who have influenced the debate worldwide. And we've got 20 of them. And Australian historians haven't noticed more than 4 of them. And they don't discuss them in their books on political thought. The greatest political theorist in the world is an Australian living in Canberra. Everybody knows that. Not ever mentioned in Australian political thought circles, and there isn't a monograph. The most important book in the Southern Hemisphere in political theory in the last 25 years was written by a well-known Australian, Ran Connell, who some people will know very, very well. And then we've had the 2 best political theorists other than Judith Butler in feminist theory. In the whole world, the 2 best people are Australian. Never mentioned. Why? Oh, well, they left the country, didn't they? I mean, after all, going to Princeton's terrible, and what about if you went to Moscow? And there, one is Rosie Braidotti, who's the world's leading theory of posthumanism at the University of Utrecht, and the other is Elizabeth Gross, who went to America, both friends of mine, but you get the impression. And then, I could go on and on and on, then there are Chinese people here. What about He Bagang? You've never heard of He Bagang. Well, that's not your fault, but you should, because it's someone who wrote about deliberate democracy, someone born in China, yes, but lived here most of his intellectual life, cited throughout the world, but not in Australia. Well, I can go on a bit more. But surely this idea that Australian political thought is original, that's not new, is it? No. There was a version of this story in Labourist and nationalist claims. In the past, people said, Australia was the social laboratory of the world. And a version of it emerges as well by any comparison with the United States. And if you know American political thought and you know Australian political thought, you'll see that the contrast is very, very strong. Australia has no theological account of its exceptionalism. It has no doctrine of manifest destiny. There's no notion in Australia of the metaphysical importance of the sea. Australians believe the land is metaphysically important and Indigenous agree with them. But Americans, as you know from their literature, have a profound sense of the metaphysical meaning of the sea. But no one in Australia suggests, or ever has suggested, that our institutions should have a Pacific character. There's also obvious contrast between the Australian sense of the duty of the government to help you and the American view that it shouldn't do that. And I can go on. Our last example maybe makes it all very clear. American thought, political thought, is entirely principle-based. Talk about politics in America, they start talking about principles. No Australian has ever talked about principles in that sense. Australians don't deduce their political theory from first principles. They have a kind of fear of grand theory, partly because when they tried to read it at uni, they fell asleep. Now, I've admitted to you there are two versions of the originality of Australian political thought. The first version, an old Australianist version, which I think has great merit, is that social situational analysis shows how original Australia is. I think that's right. And my version emphasises creative intellectuals. And what I want to say to you, almost by finale, is that these two things come together. It's the social situational reality that enables the people who come here from all over the world to think differently. Thank you very much.
We're going to invite some questions, both online and from the audience as well. Although, can I begin with a clarification?
Sure.
Right. So you referred to two of the world leading political thinkers, but you didn't actually name who they were.
I gave two women as examples of that, I think. But I can add more if you want men.
No, I'm just interested
Peter
in...
Singer, after all, a pretty obvious case. Philip Pettit is the theorist of republicanism, the best in the world. Yeah. And Peter Singer is also, of course, an Australian, is also an outstanding person. And I can add another age of 10, this Hedley Bull, who's one of the most important people in international relations theory of the 20th century, also Australian. It's a long, long list.
Yeah, but you said at the beginning, though, that there needs to be a test, a criteria.
For the originality.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, for example, in my field, there's no doubt that, Bob Goodin and John Dryzek lead the world
they're on the list.
In deliberative democratic thought, but they have much more limited impact on political practice in Australia than they do internationally.
Yes, that's fair. And that's part of the dialectic I was getting to at the end, that there's a disjunct in Australia between the people who become world famous for their original thought and the people who shape the national institutions. And that's because of a colonial anti-intellectualism. Now, everybody in Australia these days is trying to be post-colonial or decolonial, but you have to understand that the anti-colonial thing is also a colonial product. Nationalism in Australia was a heavily colonial product. If you know the people who wrote those books and you look at their photographs, you'll find they're largely Edwardian Englishmen. Some of them have funny little shirts that go up, and of course they all speak French. So even though they're banging an Australian nationalist drum, they come to an amazing degree from the colonial side. Banjo Patterson fits this pattern. And if you know the wonderful work of Sylvia Lawson, the Bulletin was the main nationalist publication in Australia. The person who ran it, Archibald, thought he was French. And didn't just walk around Sydney dressed up in French clothes. He really thought he was French. So there's a link between a certain kind of anti-intellectualism in Australia and colonialism. And that is not always seen.
The other observation that we've talked about often on the corridors is the notion of Australian exceptionalism. That there's a tendency for many academics in this area to say that Australia is exceptional.
Yes.
And that thwarts their ability to speak to a more global audience. What's your thinking around Australian exceptionalism?
I think Australia is exceptional. I think they're right about that, but they don't get the nature of the exceptionality clear. And these days they think it's about the land. And I brought that up in the paper. See, they never talk about the sea. Well, that's not American at all. There is a strong exceptionalist thing, but it's also based on never looking at the comparison. So if, for example, you're interested in Australian history and republicanism, as I am, well, you ought to be looking at Afrikaner republicanism and asking, was it any different in South Africa? They've never done it. One historian in Australia has looked at that. Why don't they do it? Well, they can't read Afrikaans. Okay, well, is that acceptable? No, of course it's not. And then you say, what about Canada? Well, there is a journal of Australian Canadian scholars, generation of Australians who were educated in Canada, but none of them have decent French. So imagine what version of Canada you get if you can talk in restaurants and can't really read Deleuze or Guattari or Badiou. And that's the story. There are people in Australia with those languages in very high level, but they don't write Australian history. So the exceptionalism is true, but they've got the wrong version of it because they haven't looked at the comparison. If you want to say that England isn't like Scotland, well, that's fine, that's true, isn't it? But you'd have to know a bit about Scotland and England, wouldn't you? But Australian historians know very little about countries other than here. And not much about here once you move out of Sydney and Melbourne. Try anyone you know on Darwin intellectual history. I can't do much. I've been there, and I noticed, of course, that it's part of Indonesia, which is the main thing you need to know. But there's nothing in the literature on Darwin intellectual history. Try Charters Towers, I mentioned that. Try Cooktown. Henry Reynolds made a huge contribution to Australian history when he pointed out that northern Queensland has got nothing to do with Sydney or Melbourne. It's multicultural and multilinguistic. Japanese is widely spoken, and so on and so on. Yes, well, the same thing is true in area after area. We need, in any science, you have to look at the whole range of data and not just, imagine studying bees and only looking at bees in Redfern. That would be ridiculous. Well, there's a version of that in the Australian exceptionalism, I think.
Jack.
Thanks so much, Wayne. So we're living with this delusional imaginary that's a result of a fragmented intellectual history of our political
And colonialism.
And colonialism, of course. And we're living in the year of the voice, or through the year of the voice referendum. What's the role of the modern or present Australian intellectual in reimagining or imagining a new, more coherent idea of Australia, given that our sense of our own history, of our own intellectual history, is so patched and fragmented?
Well, I think there are half a dozen answers to that, obviously, could take 2 hours, but a crucial part of the answer to that is, who do you have to defend yourself to? In colonial Australia, people are defending themselves to the governor or to the colonial administrator if you're Indigenous. They're defending themselves to have power over them. But modern Australia has to defend itself to China. China is a very important country. It's going to overtake the United States, in my view. I go there every year. I was trained by the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution. I do know something about China, I can promise you. And it's a very wonderful country. And if you know the Chinese elite, they make people in our parliament look ridiculous. I mean, President Xi not only knows about Goethe, the greatest German poet, but he can recite the whole of Goethe's Faust in Chinese. No one in the federal parliament could recite it in English or German. And the idea that they would be able to understand it in Chinese is ridiculous. So we've got to present ourselves to people we need to defend ourselves with. And it's not an anti-Chinese speech, this in any way, but in order to present to China, we have to claim to be good neighbours, we have to claim to be very clever people, we have to claim to be slightly dangerous people, and we have to claim to be people who can help China. And I'll just say a couple more things on that and you'll see the answer, Jack. Australians don't know the importance of their political theory in the rest of the world. Take an example. What about our importance of our political thought in China? Well, no one in Australian history really knows there was any importance in China, but modern Chinese thought was all essentially shaped by Liang Qichao. Liang Qichao came to Australia. He learned about citizenship in Australia, and Chinese theories of citizenship now are influenced by what Liang Qichao learned in Australia. We should know that, and we should say that to our Chinese friends. And it's not the only example. The whole of the 20th century Chinese political development was influenced by a Newcastle journalist called Donald, who didn't speak a word of Chinese, but of course was the go-between the major warlords. Now I can go on and on, I won't go on anymore, but you get the point. We need to be able to present ourselves to powerful friends, including the United States. Australia projects very badly into America. We have a chair of Australian studies at Harvard, someone goes every year, nobody goes to their classes. Why don't they go to the classes? Well, because they're very boring, because they don't engage with America's main thinkers. Why not? Well, because they haven't studied them. If I bring up Charles Sturt Centre, the greatest American philosopher there's ever been, most Australian historians do not even know who he was. And if I ask you to discuss his existential graphs, his main contribution to the history of mathematics, they've never looked at it. Well, that's not acceptable. If you want to be taken seriously in the serious world, you have to come over as dangerous and strong and a very good person to have as a friend. So it's not a critical point, but it is a somewhat military point.
Questions, observations? Yeah.
Just on that American point, just a thought occurred to me. So Marilyn Lake's book on Australian and American progressivism at the turn of the 20th century, she talks quite a bit about the relationship, say, between Alfred Deakin and Josiah Royce, the great American idealist philosopher. I just wonder what you make of her analysis or her idea of the influence of Australian thinking on American progressivism at that time.
Well, I can say two things about it because I've known Marilyn for about 35 years. She's right. The Americans get a lot of their key ideas from the Australians, and they come to Australia to learn from the Australians. It's a brilliant example of what I'm saying. But the crucial point to know is that Marilyn wrote the book at Harvard. She was the Professor of Australian Studies at Harvard. And when she was in Melbourne, she wasn't so keen on foreign influence in Australia. I had a number of tense conversations with her. But when she got to America, she realised that knowing about foreign things wasn't anti-Australian. It's how you showed how original the Australians were. So she actually demonstrates my claim in spades, I think.
So how would you... So, do you think that the liberal tradition has been ascendant? Here. Well, for the first thing, the main thing to know about the liberal tradition in Australia, as
of course,
opposed to Mill.
Yes, well, what you have to know about it is that most of the people who write about it are politically committed, and it's equally true on the Labour side. You know, people who write about Labourism in Australia are very likely to like the Australian Labor Party and are probably members. And most of them are not members of the Communist Party. Some of them once were, but on the whole, they're not. And if you ask them about Albania in the communist period, they won't be able to talk about that. And they won't be able to talk about communist Vietnam either, very clearly. They'll have been there, but they don't have Russian. And the key language for Hanoi is not Vietnamese, it's Russian. In the same sort of way, the people who've written about liberalism, there are about 4 of them, they're all heavily committed. David Kemp is the son of the main liberal economist in Melbourne, and of course was the advisor to Fraser. And his books are extremely prejudiced on the liberal side. Greg Maluish is not a liberal, he's a conservative. He's my cousin, he's an outstanding Australian historian. But Greg wouldn't be offended if I said that he's very strongly committed to a certain view. Other people have written other books. The whole of the literature in the field, I think, is odd. Why do I think it's odd? Because none of them analyse liberalism throughout the world. And if you said to any of them, give me a lecture on Chicherin, tell me about Chicherin, they're going to say, who? Well, Chicherin was the most important Russian liberal. And if you know about Chicherin, you know that he was, when I say he's a liberal, his politics are like Putin's basically, but he's radically liberal in the Russian context, not in the Australian context. They've never heard of most liberals in South America, and the knowledge of Italian and French liberalism is also weak. I think I said in the lecture, the influence of French thought is very great here, but it's not so great on the Australian historians. Manning had quite a lot of French, wrote a great book on Tocqueville, but there's no real evidence of him understanding French philosophy. If you said to him Descartes was an Augustinian, I don't think he knew what that meant. And that may sound unkind, but I was asked by Manning Clark to come to the ANU. I was supposed to write my doctorate with Manning. I did know Manning. Manning was wonderful. But I wouldn't have said that he had a deep knowledge of French liberalism. I do know something about it because A.G.L. Shaw, a very famous Australian historian, taught me at Sydney University. But what did he teach me? And this is the colonial thing in spades again. Well, I learned French political thought from him. And I was also taught by John Ward, another very famous Australian historian. What did he teach? Well, he taught me a lot. What did he teach me? He never mentioned Australia. He never mentioned Australia once, and I spent my honeymoon in his house. What he talked to me about was the Caribbean, and he made me write an essay, and I did write an essay, on the British Empire in 1712. And I said there wasn't any, and John Ward took his hearing aid out and burst out laughing and said you could be an historian. So it's not that the liberal tradition wasn't important here, it was important, but you've got to sort out which bits and where. Queensland didn't have liberalism in the same sense as Victoria or New South Wales. Liberalism in the West has a different colour again. The liberal ideas that come here are always received. I mean, it's a famous concept, of course, in the literature, but Australian historians don't tend to quote it. It's called misrecognition, and it's about how the ideas that come are interpreted locally, and also about which ideas don't come. In Australia, an enormous amount of stuff did not come. I'll just give you one example. I was once invited to the ANU to discuss Polish republicanism with the world's leading historian of Poland. And of course he told me, and I didn't know, that the Poles had a wonderful republic based on nobles and they had a king. Well, I didn't know any of that. So the point is that we can't do the history of liberalism without knowing more about it. One of the best books is written by a very wonderful Australian historian, Tim Rouse, but it's heavily indebted to the Australian reception of Althusser. Well, I don't know whether people know about Althusser anymore. He was very important here once. He murdered his wife, and once he murdered his wife, no one ever mentioned him again. So liberalism is crucial here, but there are many sorts. Lots of liberal ideas don't come here. And the ideas that do come here are given a strange twist. And you can see that if you go to Washington, of course, because once you say you're a liberal in America, people are inclined to say, oh, you mean you're a communist? Well, that's not the Australian tradition.
Thank you, Wayne. I have a question, Wayne. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about utilitarianism.
Yeah.
And as you know, there's a sort of a cardinal doctrine in Australian history that we are a Benthamite society. And I've been sceptical of that for a long time, and I was pleased to hear that you had some objections to sort of the notion that we are utilitarian or we are just a Benthamite society. And I was hoping actually you'd just talk a bit more about that. I mean, what are the issues that you have with that thesis, because it's so prevalent?
Well, the issue is the people who write about it don't know anything about the utilitarians, because there are about 7 utilitarians. They're rather complicated people. Mill is the editor of the Westminster Review. Mill could talk about any country in the world. And the reception here is not of his enormous knowledge, not even of his knowledge of India. There's very little reception of that. So when you say utilitarians, you really mean a couple of simple principles. Well, yes, they came to Australia. Yes, in Tasmania, the prison at Port Arthur does show Bentham's conception of criminality. That's true. It's true that McConaughey in Tasmania was a utilitarian. That's true. It's true that South Australia was a utilitarian project. So there's plenty of evidence for utilitarian influence here. But it's always mixed with other influences. And what's wrong with the famous utilitarian thesis is they don't look at anyone else. It's like the English thesis. English and Scottish are important here. Well, yes, right. But which people, and what did they know and what didn't they know, and who had the office next door? Let me just give one very silly example. The most important philosopher of the last 50 years in Australia was John Anderson. And John Anderson was a kind of crazy atheist theologian. And he was a wonderful genius. And his students dominated the politics of New South Wales and the legal profession. I was taught by about 7 of them, and they all had teeth fall out and hair fall out. But John Anderson was a wonderful man. But there was no reception in Australia of his actual philosophy. And in his very last lecture, he gets up and tells his students, who've all decided, of course, that he's a rationalist and a positivist and somebody who doesn't pay any attention to idealist ideas. In the last lecture, Anderson says, I'm a follower of Hegel and Plato. Well, they didn't understand. So I think the answer is that the reception was partial, involved an element of misrecognition, and went with other things. So yes, of course, I mean, I've read the utilitarians. Of course, everybody in this room who's done political thought has done some reading of the utilitarians. That's absolutely fair. But we haven't read other people that were enormously important. And the example I might throw in there is take the Italian influence. Now, if you say Italian political thought was very important in Australia, well, Australian historians don't really say that. But we now know that when Mazzini died, thousands and thousands of people marched in Sydney. Not 5 people, maybe 50,000 marched, because Mazzini had died. And who else read Mazzini? Well, Inglis Clark, who wrote Section 116, as you know, is the most important Australian non-civic Republican. Inglis Clark had Mazzini's photo in 5 of his rooms. So the idea that Italian political thought didn't come here was insane. If you talk about fascist thought, well, obviously Santa Maria wrote his thesis on Italian fascism. The Catholic clergy were heavily informed about Spanish, Italian and French fascism. There was great enthusiasm for Vichy on the Catholic side in Australia. Belloc, as you know, was immensely influential here. So, yes, they're important utilitarians, but they come up with about 8 others, and then you have to see how they interact. Because although I found 40 or 50 strands, I didn't say, and I should have probably said, they weave. So you take Australian Marxism, everyone knows the Communist Party was important here. One time it was the biggest Communist Party in the English-speaking world. But people who were communists in Australia had a very strange selection of knowledges. None of them until 1970 had enough German to understand Karl Marx. There was, it's true, a great genius in Sydney, a friend of mine, and he spent his whole life in Moscow translating for the Russians. But he was in Moscow, not in Sydney. And when I was a student at Sydney University, nobody gave a lecture on Marx that showed any understanding of Marx at all. And the same with Hegel. It all changed, of course, when they came from Lukács's people arrived. Suddenly there were people from Budapest, and of course they could understand Marx, and they could speak French, and they had Russian as well. They could do it all. But before that, in Australia, the communists had a very strange view of the world. You may know that Manning Clark went to Russia and couldn't decide whether Lenin or Christ was the saviour to follow. And he sat for days and days in Manuka Cathedral up the road trying to work out whether he believed in God. And he was buried as a non-Catholic from Manuka Cathedral, as a man of no belief but great faith. So we need to put these things into interaction. They're not separated. And people who know about one know about others. I might just conclude that point with an obvious but very clear example. When I was a young student, I was invited to meet the leaders of the Communist Party in Australia for an Australian Christian dialogue. And we met Roger Gorody, who was the leading French communist of the time. And we had about 4 hours of intimate conversation in that centre of Australian labourism, Mosman. So that's where the Communist Party were living. And we had this wonderful meeting there with this great French Marxist philosopher. 2 weeks later, he became a Muslim, but it was interesting. And what I discovered, of course, is that people who were communist intellectuals, and they were very fine communist intellectuals, were really wanting to talk about God and really wanted to read theology books. So that tells you that these strands interact, and in ways you couldn't predict. And just to end it with a bang, both of the Aarons were trained in China. Their Marxism was based on what they learned in China. And China didn't even translate Marx. China got 2 volumes by Stalin, Historical Materialism and Dialectical Materialism, and only translated the dialectical. So imagine what nonsense the Aaron brothers learned in Beijing.
So on the Labour side, I'll come down, but on the Labour side, I've often sort of reflected on how little influence, for example, the Webbs, Lasky, the Fabians have had on Australian labour movements. And when you go, for example, to the Museum of Australian Democracy, it's a testimony to liberalism rather than a social history. You know, you have to go to the Eureka Museum for kind of a social history. Why is it that those influences that were hugely influential in the UK, you know, the birth of the London School of Economics, for example, was a sort of the living embodiment of the influence of that thinking. Why did that not have the same impact here?
I think it's a matter of social class. The Fabians were very important in Australia, particularly in Melbourne. But most people who were Fabian were not working class people. Fabians tended to be lower middle class people or even higher. They were often very well educated people. And when they looked out on the world, they tried to find people with benevolent social ideas. And they did know about the Webbs, and they did know about Lasky. I wrote about Lasky at university. This stuff was received, but it didn't have an immediate impact on policy in Australia. It didn't solve any problem Australia had, is the way I put it. So part of what we're talking about tonight, of course, is the mismatch between the ideas that come from other countries and our problems. Sometimes they help, but very often we have problems that they didn't have elsewhere. I've written last year about Charles Strong, who was a very important person in Melbourne, one of the founders of Australian progressive institutions, fair wage, all kinds of things. And he was a Scottish clergyman from Scotland. But I can show you that although he was very important in Melbourne, and although he did study all kinds of ideas in Scotland, he didn't bring the Scottish ideas really here at all. That's not right. And what he did do in Melbourne was in response to Australian conditions, depression and war. So I think that those people were influential at an intellectual level in certain class strata, but I don't think they went to policy. And I also think, perhaps the last point, Australians didn't have much sense of how they worked into the British system. So, for example, the Webbs, of course, were very accomplished and cultivated people, and young Winston Churchill, as you might say an arch-conservative person, goes to see them, and he goes to Germany with their help, and in Germany he studies the German welfare system, and he comes back to Britain and says, we need this. So there's a policy impact in Britain through the Webbs. But when you went to the Webbs, of course, the servants would have served the tea. Well, there would have been some of that in Melbourne, to be fair, but that's not really the Australian style, is it? I mean, how many times have you had tea served by servants in an Australian house?
Thank you very much for your talk. I just wondered, what are your thoughts about the fact that Australia is a continent in which mass extinction has reached a maximum more than other continents? That Australia is a country which has conducted genocide against the original population, the Aboriginals, has conducted a semi-genocide against the Chinese, and is now serving the military purposes of great empires.
Well, I agree with all that except for the noun, because it isn't Australia that does it. We have to be very precise about who does what. So in the case of the maltreatment of Indigenous people, that's very clear in Australia, and it's there fairly early on. It's heavily the work of settlers. It's not fair entirely to blame it on London, because London, at least on paper, doesn't support this kind of thing. Whether they did in practice is a bit more subtle, but it's very much Australian settlers who do that. And then, of course, in Queensland, where there's shocking genocide, you couldn't be more right, but you have to remember it's black troopers who are shooting the blacks, not white troopers for the most part. So this is a complicated story. And yes, there's very strong evidence of genocide throughout the country, that's fair. The Chinese thing is also, you may have seen the TV programs on that, there's plenty of evidence of harsh treatment of the Chinese. It is complicated because the people who hated the Chinese in Australia were the working class. And the Labour Party was the racist party in Australia. Why? Because these people were working for almost no wages and taking money from Australian workers. And that's why there was such hatred of the Chinese in Melbourne. If you want to know about that, there's a Chinese scholar in Australia, Dai Jur, and she's just written a brilliant, brilliant essay on the representation of Indigenous in the Chinese press in 1900. And so even in 1900, Chinese are trying to argue Indigenous should be treated more fairly. So this is not an anti-Chinese point I'm making. But there are many sources of this violence, of course. And you have to remember, it's not just the nasty cases. After all, we have Anzac Day as a national celebration. Well, what are we celebrating? Australian kids going to Gallipoli to kill Turkish children. And for what reason? To please Winston Churchill, who was the author of that horrendous development. Why were we fighting Turkey? We had no possible reason to fight Turkey. Okay, they're allied to Germany during the war, that is fair. But it's extraordinary. And then, of course, we went to South Africa, to Sudan, and we fought in the Boer War. People in my family fought in the Boer War. What were they doing? They're going to South Africa to kill Afrikaners. Why? Because London asked them to. So we mustn't blame just one or two people, and we mustn't make Australia the demon. That the land didn't do this, obviously, and there isn't a unity across the country behind these offences. There are many of them, and you could add more. I mean, it's not the war in Iraq is more evidence. You can find stuff in Afghanistan, and Vietnam's not happy either, as you would also know.
Any other questions or observations? No, there's two quick questions I wanted to put. So you refer to the impact of the German philosophers, but you didn't really go into much detail in relation to that. Well, I'm particularly interested in the Schemter observations. Is that in relation to the workfare state ideas?
Two things are crucial in Australia. It is not well known because historians generally in Australia don't have German. Some do, Mark McKenna does, for example, but they don't have intellectual German. They can, again, talk in the restaurant. But that's different from reading major philosophers. The crucial factor is David Syme. David Syme is the father of protection in Victoria. He edits The Age. He's a crucial factor in Australian conservative politics. David Syme was educated in Germany, in Heidelberg, and he studied Fichte. And the account of the state he promotes in Victoria is based on the political philosopher of Fichte. And Australians don't say that because they don't know about the philosophy of Fichte. I don't know whether anyone in this room has read the Wissenschaftslehre. It's available in 27 different versions. It's a nightmare. But Fichte is one of the most important philosophers, of course, of the 19th century, and his impact here is huge, but hidden. Second example is political economy, thinking about state and government. The crucial figure there is not Adam Smith, which goes to your liberal point, it's Liszt. Friedrich List has a huge impact here. Again, German. And let me just take a more practical, down-to-earth example, because you'll see how my argument begins to come together. Australians are rightly proud of their institutional innovations. Well, one of our best institutional innovations is Torrens title. And it's been copied in virtually every country in the world. It's a huge breakthrough and shows what a practical, sensible people we are. Yes. But where does it come from? Oh, well, there was a man called Torrens and he lived in Adelaide. Well, yes, that's very true. But he knew a German, and that German had been Bismarck's Germany, and he told them how Germans did it, and Torrens developed it here. So all through the Australian story there is practicality, but it's secretly linked, I think, to intellectuals we've forgotten. And they are secretly linked to a whole variety of influences, not only from Europe, also from the Pacific, also from Latin America. People have forgotten that Hobart and Chile had an enormous trade in the whaling industry. People have forgotten that, of course, we were the colonial power in New Guinea. They've also forgotten that John Dunmore Lang, who's a hero of Republican thinking in Australia, John Dunmore Lang wanted to set up an empire based on slaves all over Asia. So we need to look at the international side to get the national side right. I'm not suggesting you ignore the people who wrote in the Australian towns and go off to Iceland. I'm not saying that. But often you'll find there are hidden connections. Because people who are creative, of course, have a funny habit of looking at the map.
So I'm going to ask you a final question if nobody else has got any questions or observations, and it's a very... Oh, good.
Just where do we get to go? Where are lecture books? You said that comes to... So I just want to know where to get professors.
Well, I haven't finished it yet. I'm only starting it. It will... Oh, the books are all available.
Do you have anything you can buy?
Well, I can't give you the copies tonight, but you can get them from Monash Publishing and Melbourne University Press and various other presses. Bloomsbury in London, various presses in America.
Yeah, you can go to direct, if you Google his name directly, it will trigger into Amazon, etc. But look, the final question I was going to ask you, and it's a very unkind question, but in the same way that as a consequence of COVID-19, economists have had to completely rethink some of their fundamental assumptions, particularly in relation to formal modelling, how do political theorists need to make sense of a post-COVID world? Are you starting to see the development of, I don't know, could be the reinvention of old ideas? So, for example, we know that there's been an upsurge of interest in participatory design, for example, in politics. Are you seeing some new trends emerging in political thought?
I think the key problem is that Australians, like other Europeans, went into disciplinary apartheid in the 19th century. And so we had people who did economics, and people who did politics, and people who did philosophy, and people who did history, and so on and so on and so forth. They weren't in the same departments. They didn't always have tea together, and they didn't read each other's books. And that's had a colossally negative effect, because when you're trying to understand a real problem, you don't have to go very far before you find that the economics and the politics and the sociology are all interconnected. And so if you go to apartheid, you end up with the situation of Australian economics. Now, Australia actually had some of the most original economists in the world. I didn't say that tonight, but we're quite famous for the quality of our economics until about 1970, and after that it drops off because we Americanized. So instead of having general intellectuals who are Australian, who write books that the whole world reads, we begin to get people who write 20 articles a year in the American journals. And they repeat the American doctrine. They repeat all the things coming from Milton Friedman. The ANU turns into a powerhouse of this. And there are a few people in South Australia, Geoffrey Harcourt, for example, on another story. But essentially our economic thought ceases to be original because we're colonised. And we keep the apartheid. Now, in order to go into your post-COVID world, we're going to have to develop people who can think across those boundaries. And of course, before this happened, people could do that. If you look even in the 19th century, certainly in the 18th century, a major intellectual in the 18th century probably doesn't have a university job. And they're not sitting there saying, I'm an economist, and they're certainly not saying, I'm in politics. No. Think about the French. Think about Diderot. Diderot is, of course, one of the great thinkers of the 18th century, but he writes physics and political theory and literature and plays, and it goes on and on and on. So once we had transversality across all the disciplines, and now we have apartheid. And it's particularly extreme, and this is your economics point, in the case of mathematics, of course, because people who know a lot about mathematics don't become economists. People who do economics have middle-level high math, but people who are professors of pure maths don't read economics and don't use that sort of maths. Now, if we had move it across the disciplines, we would undermine that, you see, because then you'd have economists who were able to talk to people in these other areas and integrate the ideas. And that's where we have to go, I think. I don't think, particularly with AI, I haven't talked that tonight, but I don't think we can stay in the 19th century boxes. I don't think so.
So obviously a lot of people are arguing now that we're moving to a completely different epoch. We're moving out of that neoliberal paradigm that COVID-19 has demonstrated to people the importance of government, but also the importance of balanced social and economic development and the social equality agenda. As a consequence, do you expect to see more progressive social movement activity emerging over the next period?
Well, it depends on which country in the world we want to talk about. It won't be this.
Okay, do you think we'll still see the culture of contentment dominating our political line?
I think Australia is having huge problems at the moment with understanding what's happening in the world. The key idea you need to know and have is the civilizational state. The major countries in the world have gone back to the pre-modern civilizational state. So Turkey is not just Turkey, as you know, it's the whole Ottoman Empire rebuilt right across those stands. All of them have gone back to the Ottoman model. What about Russia? Well, Russia's gone back to a Tsarist civilizational model. It's not pretending to be a democracy and certainly not pretending to be a socialist country or a left-wing country. India, you've seen, has revived a Hindu civilizational model. Modi has not only banned religious marriage, but is now trying to get rid of English. China has returned to the civilizational model of 19th century China. Its foreign policy is very similar to that of the Chinese emperors in the 19th century. This argument goes on and on. So what is happening in different parts of the world is quite different. But the civilizational state is the important one because it shows you that the modern institutional system won't meet all of the challenges if you're an old country. If you're a new country, it's quite different. And new countries, I'm not sure what new countries would do, and we're a new country in that sense. But I don't think we'll survive without a reform of democratic process. I know Mark's worked on that in many countries in the world, and without that I don't think we'll survive. I don't think we'll survive unless we can say what we've done with Indigenous people and give a proper account of it. This gentleman's totally right. I don't think we'll survive if we can't project effectively into the United States. I go to America every year. I have American family on both sides of my family. I've just published a book with 2 big chapters on the Mormons. It'd be wrong to think I'm anti-American, although I do attack America in my talks. I'm actually a pretty American Australian, but we're not projecting effectively into the United States because look who we send. Imagine sending Joe Hockey to persuade America that Australia was fine.
So Wayne, we've reached the end of our time together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a thought-provoking hour, and I invite everybody now to join us for a drink and some.
And thank you all for coming.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
on a cold Canberra night.
Wayne Hudson.
Thank you.